we're told, well, this is something the president has to ponder over for a week or so. And that's ridiculous. We know perfectly well that if this was China, they would say he's a paper tiger. In other words, someone who sounds fierce but is toothless at the end of the event. And that is very disturbing. I take no pleasure in making these comments, because when the President of the United States cannot be believed when he issues a clear threat to a potential aggressor as to what will happen if that aggression happens, how will that be received in Taiwan?
The UK and European Union have summoned their respective Russian ambassadors after overnight strikes killed at least 21 people and hit the British and EU government buildings in Kyiv. It was the second biggest attack of the war so far, with 629 drones and missiles launched at the Ukrainian capital. Sir Keir Starmer condemned the attack in a statement on X. Here it is, voiced by one of our producers.
My thoughts are with all those affected by the senseless Russian strikes on Kyiv, which have damaged the British Council building. Putin is killing children and civilians and sabotaging hopes of peace. This bloodshed must end.
Well, earlier we heard from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, who gave Donald Trump's reaction to the attack.
He was not happy about this news, but he was also not surprised. So the president is continuing to watch this intently, and this killing, unfortunately, will continue as long as the war continues, which is why the president wants it to end. And that's why he's worked harder than anyone to end this war, which would have never started if he were president. But perhaps both sides of this war are not ready to end it themselves. The president wants it to end, but the leaders of these two countries need it to end and want it to end, must want it to end as well. And I think the president will make some additional statements on this later.
There we go. More from Donald Trump to come. Let's speak to Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary and visiting Professor of War Studies at King's College. Good evening to you, Sir Malcolm Rifkind.
Good evening.
What will the UK hope to achieve from summoning the Russian ambassador?
Well, let's first of all remember this was a very, very dangerous escalation by Putin against Ukraine, because for the first time we found attacks in Ukraine not on military targets or economic targets or power stations or something of that kind. This appears to have been a deliberate attack on residential communities, people who had no connection with the war themselves, who were either chosen at random, or, combined with this, we saw some of the targets happened to be the European Union's own offices in Kiev, the British Council, who share a same building, but also the Azerbaijan embassy. So you had both diplomatic buildings, you had people killed, substantially more than in the past because of the sheer scale of the attacks. And that's what surprised me by what we've just heard, the spokesman of President Trump, implying this is just a continuation of what's happened before. It's not. It is a deliberate attack on civilians, on residential communities, on diplomatic establishments. And if all the White House can say is, well, this is just what we've been expecting, that is pretty pathetic, to put it mildly.
Well, look, at least 20 locations across 7 districts of Ukraine's capital were targeted, 100 buildings near or thereabouts. So that's what the head of Kyiv's administration said today, to give our listeners some idea of the scale of it. And look, Russia has targeted civilian infrastructure and residential areas. Whether they would do that on purpose or whether they would say that that was collateral is not...
No, it could only be collateral damage if they were going for a target which was military target or some economic significance, and somehow the bomb ended in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Well, this wasn't one bomb. These were large numbers of missiles, very large numbers of drone attacks.
Well, this was a premeditated...
You can tell a residential area from a military base.
Yes, this was a premeditated, organised attack on Kyiv. It was meant to send a message. And as you say, the British Council building was also struck. It's the first time that a government British government building in Kyiv has been attacked since Moscow's full-scale invasion in February 2022. What sort of, from a diplomatic angle then, and from your experience, what would the UK be hoping to achieve by summoning their Russian ambassador?
Well,
what does that actually do?
Nobody's claiming a dramatic amount happens because you summon an ambassador. First of all, that is the right response in the immediate aftermath of something of this kind, particularly because it was the British Council that was one of the buildings that were significantly damaged. So, of course, when you know another country's military might is attacking targets, which include one from your own country, the first step you have to make is not the only step. The first step you have to make is to call in the senior representative of that government in your country, the Russian ambassador in this case, and challenge him to explain what is going on, why this happened. Do they claim it was an accident? Or were these deliberate targets? Now, it doesn't matter whether we believe their answers, but it's always important to find out what their official explanation is. We haven't yet been told what the ambassador has said when he went to the Foreign Office. He may not have known himself. Because frankly, when you're dealing with a dictatorship like Putin's, even his closest advisors sometimes aren't told what's going on.
Andrei Kelin, of course, is Russia's ambassador to the UK. He spoke to the Foreign Office at 1 o'clock, and you're right, we've not heard the outcome of that at all. What is the you were Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. What is it, or the relevance of the British Council building in Kyiv? I was reading a piece earlier, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of this or not, but I wanted to ask your opinion on it. That Russia, for their part, believes the British Council is, and the quote is here, a nefarious nest of espionage, that the Putin regime's waged war against the British Council for more than 17 years, that is a building that is familiar with the wrath of the Kremlin.
Well, look, first of all, we're not talking about a British Council building in Moscow. So if it's being suggested that a British Council building in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is a basis for espionage against Russia, I mean, that only has to be presented to be seen as totally ludicrous. The British Council is very similar to what many other countries have. It is a way of developing cultural contacts, personal contacts, educational links, English language links. We do that in many countries around the world. And these governments, vast numbers of governments, welcome the British Council because that is something that enhances the value of these contacts with their own country. So, but it wasn't just the British Council. I mean, this is an important point. It was the European Union's office in Kiev, and it was also, this is the puzzling one, most puzzling, it was the Azerbaijan embassy. So what was the reason behind that? It may have, that part of it may have been an accident, but we don't know at this stage.
You spoke about Donald Trump's assessment of this earlier.
Well, his spokesman's reaction, we don't know what he himself has personally said.
Well, as Caroline Levitt likes to point out, I know what President Trump thinks because I've spoken to him about this, so we can only assume that she's translating the direct
that's a
message.
fair assumption.
the direct message of her boss. You've called that an extremely weak response. I mean,
I think that was a polite way of putting it.
I think it was. Look, I mean, this in some way, is it not, is rather a humiliation for Donald Trump, who to much fanfare held that Alaska summit with Vladimir Putin, warmly shook his hand.
Well, the
They were
summit itself
smiling.
was a mistake from the start because you don't have a summit without doing a lot of preparatory work. But in addition to that, there's some self-imposed foolishness by President Trump. He had made it clear, we thought, publicly, that if Russia reacted in a hostile way, then the United States would impose very severe additional sanctions, would give far more help to Ukraine, and would punish Russia in that way. Now, not a word of that has been said since the end of the summit. And when asked, we're told, well, this is something the president has to ponder over for a week or so. And that's ridiculous. We know perfectly well that if this was China, they would say he's a paper tiger. In other words, someone who sounds fierce, but is toothless at the end of the event. And that is very disturbing. I take no pleasure in making these comments, because when the president of the United States cannot be believed when he issues a clear threat to a potential aggressor as to what will happen if that aggression happens, how will that be received in Taiwan, facing possible invasion by China and having been promised help and assistance by the United States? Who else will take comfort from that? So there are wider repercussions simply than the impact for Ukraine, important though that is at this moment in time.
Do you think Donald Trump himself will feel humiliated by this?
Well, if it was a self-imposed one. I mean, it was nonsense to believe. You see, he's got form. In his first time as president, we all recall that he invited the leader, the president of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, the dictator, one of the most vile dictators around the world. And without any preparation, he was invited to meet the president of the United States, something he never dreamt would ever happen. And Trump had convinced himself, though nobody else, that the sheer force of his own personality and skill and negotiating deals would mean that as a result of that meeting, the North Koreans would give up their nuclear weapons. It was absurd. It never happened. North Korea now has more nuclear weapons than they had at that time. And yet he learns from nothing from his own previous experience because he's surrounded by sycophants. He's not, most presidents and prime ministers of Western countries, their advisors are there not just to tell them what they want to hear, but to warn them against some of the ideas. I had that myself when I was Foreign Secretary. I had my immediate staff, who were Foreign Office diplomats, occasionally would say, no, this is not very wise what you're suggesting, Minister. Now, I might not agree with them, but I'd have to listen very carefully because they were professional people with many years of experience. And every previous president of the United States, Democrat or Republican, would have behaved in that way as well. Trump is the first to ensure that those around him will only say, yes, Mr. President, you're so wise, Mr. President, you're so successful in everything you do. That is the sadness of what the world is having to live with, and American people in particular.
So Malcolm Rifkind, should the UK dial things up a notch and expel the Russian ambassador?
I very much doubt that will happen, and I've never been convinced that that is a wise reaction. At the end of the day, it doesn't change anything if you expel an ambassador. They will then expel the British ambassador from Moscow. And all that means is an opportunity to have dialogue when it might be wise. It may not be much point in it at this precise moment. But when the time comes, you want there already to be people in place who can have a serious dialogue and help produce real results that will end this ghastly war. So I don't myself believe expelling. It's different if you find that some of the people in a Russian embassy are spies or involved with espionage in Britain. Then they have to be expelled. That's inevitably the consequence of that. But we're not in that situation at this moment in time.
Look, lovely to speak to you. Thank you for your wisdom. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary and visiting Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Thank you.